Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm a senior editor with the Mises Institute. And with me today is Tho Bishop, my associate editor. And it's time to talk about the 2021 election, especially about what's going on in Virginia and New Jersey today after last night's election. And it looks like it was a bad day for Democrats. So we'll examine that in a bit of detail. And this is a bit more of Tho's area than mine. He follows these races pretty closely. And we'll look at what this means specifically for Virginia and New Jersey, if anything, and then look at what does this mean pointing forward to the 22 races and beyond. So, Though I was told by CNN that Joe Biden is pretty much the most popular president in history, got more votes than anyone else in the history of the world. So how could this happen?
Adults are back in charge, and the public is so excited about this. As you can see at any during a chant at any major sporting event these days. No, I mean, what happened last night was, again, I like this stuff way too much for a Mises Institute libertarian. I know my faults, and that's okay. But what happened last night is just one of those moments where you can see, again, and my spin on this would be that last night was extremely encouraging because what it was is a complete rejection of the current regime. And in which case, like, even no matter what your opinions were of, say, some of the questions that existed with the election count in 2020, many of those concerns I think are valid. Right now, this sort of backlash in a state like New Jersey, that Biden won by 16 points in 2020, in Virginia, that was another double-digit win, even though it was kind of closer, early on than most expected there. But that was another big win for Biden. That rejection is, I think shows, again, a broader coalition going back against everything that we've dealt with the last 2 years, which is not simply Fauci and COVID, but it's also the consequences of the Fed and the way that they're feeling at the pumps. And that is something that we should be looking as a positive sign, regardless of, very valid critiques on, again, I don't think Virginia is going to, become Ancapistan or even Florida, because we elected Youngkin, to a governor position in the state. But this backlash, though, to the regime that we've been dealing with is something I think Rothbard would be smiling at if he was around.
Well, let's look at these one by one then. So let's look first at Virginia. So the situation there is it was a Democrat trifecta. So the Democrats controlled House, Senate, which they call Chamber of Deputies, apparently. House, Senate, and the governor's race, plus those other statewide positions that most states have, right? An attorney general, the lieutenant governor. That's apparently all they've got. We've got also a secretary of state here in Colorado, and the treasurer are all separate positions. But it looks like they've got 3 statewide positions. Those all went Republican. And also note that Terry McAuliffe is an old school Clinton family power broker. And so he drew upon a national background in terms of support and people pushing for him to win here in Virginia. So take us a little bit through then the importance not just of the governor's race, which has been most of the focus, but what some of these other races mean as well. And, you and I both know how elections like this build the bench for future elections. And you could be setting up, especially some of these statewide candidates for maybe future offices, like who knows, House or Senate or anything like that. So tell us a little bit about both the immediate and sort of the longer term significance.
One of the things I think is interesting with this, and it's interesting in some ways, the big story going into this was the degree to which Republicans have weaponized kind of the critical race theory, education side of things as a culture war issue. And that obviously, I think, really played out if you look into some of the Northern Virginia counties like Loudoun County, which McCullough still kind of advantage there, but Youngkin did double-digit advantage over previous candidates, not just Trump, who uniquely offends sort of Virginia sensibilities, at least Northern Virginia Beltway types, but also other Republican statewide candidates that did not have, suffer from that flaw, right? So it is true, I think, to a certain extent, the broadening or conservatives recognizing that this entire idea of allowing your enemies to teach your children and kind of trust them to manage things, that has been a successful Republican rallying point here.
Yeah, let's talk about critical race theory just for a minute or two, because we did a whole episode on this.
Yes.
A couple of months ago. And the issue was, and I saw this again on CNBC last night, where they reiterated this point that critical race theory doesn't exist. And their defense is that, well, we don't actually use the phrase critical race theory anywhere in our official documents. We don't tell people to teach critical race theory, right? All that means is they're not stupid enough to use the phrase, right? So let's just take an example. So if you've got all these teachers teaching your children that capitalism leads to the impoverishment of the working class and then will inevitably lead to the working class rising up and overthrowing their capitalist masters, and that the future will be more of a utopian future where everything is communally owned. And then you turn around and say, well, we don't teach Marxism in our schools. I defy you to find the word Marxism in any of our curricula. Well, obviously they're teaching Marxism, right? So that's basically what it comes down to, is we're teaching all of these students basically these bizarre racial theories, but it's not really critical race theory. So everything's fine. And I guess a lot of voters got sick of that.
Yes. And you saw this play out in a lot of dramatic scenes at school board meetings, over the last, year or so in particular. I think, there's that narrative out there that, a lot of parents, that, they're now organized on this issue, than they ever have been in the past. That the danger, of course, comes in the idea that, Republicans are going to win an election with this and they forget about it. We've seen this kind of play out, historically. Though there has been some effectiveness, if you want to look at where this sort of precedents for Republican politics or grassroots politics generally changing the curriculum was actually after the uprising against Common Core. You did actually have a lot of organization to directly change the curriculum in some of these schools in a way that was better than kind of just glossing it over, which I think is interesting. But yeah, that as an organizational tool is something that I think you're going to see Republicans kind of lean up against in a broader environment. And I think one of the things that's really interesting is now effectively the education policy of the mainstream Republican Party, which again works on a whole lot of issues, right? I'm not, but on this particular issue, Corey DeAngelis, who is a Rothbardian expert, policy expert in the field of school choice, is now kind of the go-to guy on that. And I think that is something that's very, very encouraging just nationally.
Do you think Republicans are finally getting a clue about the importance of more local races? So, right, for years, I remember, my 20 years being around lobbyists, campaign people, and all of that, they never seemed to think it was important to go to city council meetings, to run for the school board and stuff. Yeah, I mean, they did that because that's who was in those communities. But it seemed that, especially in a lot of libertarians, were like, politics is stupid. You should just totally ignore it. You should absolutely let Marxists run the school board because, it's dumb to run for school board. Do you think maybe the libertarian-minded people, whether they call themselves conservatives or not, are starting to kind of get an idea on that? Because I noticed it seemed, at least in Colorado, that a lot of these school board elections are a lot more explicitly political, with people really actually challenging the status quo in the curricula.
Not just the school board, I think down ballot as well. I can tell you from, sometimes I visit Republican Party of Florida meetings. Again, not the best habit, but they've made it very clear that they want to see Republican parties organize for ideological candidates in historically nonpartisan races, because they've recognized that basically the sort of personality that typically enjoys those positions the most are like your neighborhood progressive. Right? Like they really get off like the administration and writing, these sort of ordinances and things like that. And so, if there's any, it's one of the areas, and I think it's played out particularly with the degree to which localized control, changed your impact during the age of COVID. There's a lot of recognition that in both let's call it the best aspects of the Trump GOP, whatever, issue, as well as libertarians themselves. I think there's been a lot of discussion out there about organizing more specifically to make sure that we have sort of liberty-friendly ideologues in those local positions, after the experience with COVID, which I think is one of those bright spots that I know Jeff Dice has talked a lot about in some of his events about some of the silver linings of the horrors of the past, 18, 20 months now.
Well, let's go up the ladder then. So we got the school board's clearly an important issue.
Yes.
As you noted, down ballot stuff is apparently actually attracting some attention of people who see the importance of that. But what's hardly been talked about is the fact that the Virginia House of Deputies went Republican. And that would seem to be pretty significant to me, because if it was just the governor out there all on his own being a Republican, that would be, I think, more politically problematic for him. But it seems now he'll have the House to back him up.
Well, this is something that also we saw this play out. This is one of the overlooked narratives. There was a lot going on in 2020, was the degree to which, in spite of the fact that Biden got the White House at the presidential level, and in spite of the fact that Republicans lost the Georgia Senate seats, which were a big deal, there was not a blue wave. In fact, there was major Republican waves made nationally at that state legislative level, which was particularly important because redistricting is going on now, which, when it comes to designing those election maps, I mean, that has a lot to do with where the levels of power, are held for a decade, right? And so, what we saw here is that just this past election cycle, it's very recent that Virginians had taken a majority in that state house level, and that's what it's easy to kind of overlook, because it seems like Virginia has been a blue state for a while now. We've had 2 governors in a row. The presidential races have not been, particularly close. I mean, there've been some Senate seats that have been closer than you would expect. I think with Gillespie's race a couple of years ago. But there was a red wave in these lower election seats across the board. And this is something that we also saw in New Jersey, which I think we're going to talk about more later. We saw this in every area with an election. You pretty much saw a backlash to the Democratic agenda at all levels of government. And again, if we're looking for bright spots in the age of COVID, people saying enough is enough when it comes to restrictions, and people saying enough is enough when it comes to curriculum stuff. I mean, these are all major wins.
Yeah, state legislatures are way more important than I think people, I think they are. I don't know if we've ever talked about this on Radio Rothbard before, but of course I used to teach political science, and a lot of people didn't even know there was a state legislature. And I know that when they would go on tours at the State House, they would refer to their assemblymen as congressmen, and in their minds, there was really no distinction between federal lawmakers and state lawmakers, even though state lawmakers have huge amounts of power over their daily lives. And it would seem the Chamber of Deputies pretty big deal in Virginia. And then I saw one interpretation that was claiming that Virginia is even now a Republican trifecta now, because they noted that it was basically a 2-seat margin in the Senate. And Virginia's weird. Apparently, I just learned this yesterday. Virginia's Senate has totally separate elections, like in a separate year. They're not like staggered. And so they'll have their Senate elections, I guess, next year. And so that's a totally separate thing. So the House goes Republican. Now, the Senate is unchanged, except for the fact, according to one source, that the Attorney General votes on split votes in the state Senate in Virginia. So essentially what happened is there's a de facto increase of 1 Republican seat in the Senate there, given a 2-person margin. And this person also is claiming that one of the Dems is essentially a blue dog Democrat, so votes with Republicans a lot anyway. So now the entire state house has been flipped Republican. I don't know how that's going to work out in practice, but there was an actual gain in the Senate through electing the AG with a Republican, because that changes this balance in a chamber that has 40 seats. So there's going to be ties. Now, is that the AG? It seems like if it's the lieutenant governor, it's somebody. Someone's going to break those tie votes in an evenly numbered Senate. But that would seem like it's a big deal, too. So all this essentially reign of terror that was existing in Virginia with all these crackdowns on gun laws and everything, it seems that that's come to a skidding halt.
Yeah, I wasn't familiar with the AG voting tiebreaker aspect. I wonder if that goes back to if you look at the early attorney generals of Virginia, like it's like a particularly strong resume. You got Edmund Randolph, you got John Marshall. I wonder if that is kind of a throwback to that. I'd like to believe so. But what was also kind of interesting about this is that even though there's so much attention on the McAuliffe-Youngkin race, there was a lot of expectation that Youngkin might have been the only Republican to win that statewide. Instead, you saw that full sweep, which is interesting, particularly with the attorney general thing, which not having really to do with education policy outside of that tie-breaking vote, which I bet probably was not a motivating factor for a lot of people strategically. But when you think about the degree to which criminal justice reform sort of issues have been out there, it's been very easy to sort of imagine, a Virginia voter that's voting out, the bums, was angry at the current regime, but still, okay with sort of the criminal justice agenda that Democrats have been promoting. That being rejected here, I think it's also one of those interesting sort of things that is reflected in some of these other races. And one last thing on this is that, a couple of weeks ago, we talked about some of the inner a Democratic Party, battling going on with some of the spending bills that are still up in the air. One of the interesting things about this is that I think the weakness here shows Terry McAuliffe is not, he's a very experienced political hand. Slimeball, right? But the one thing he's good at is winning races. And yet at the end of this race, it was utterly like their messaging was non-existent. Their messaging was Youngkin equals Trump. They had nothing to run on. And this is a guy who was a, fairly popular, all things considered, governor 4 years ago. He couldn't run on his record because of the degree to which you have kind of this, Bernie, Hillary dynamic in the Democratic Party where they don't agree on a lot, kind of maybe big picture stuff, but like the issues where they disagree, they really, really disagree. He was kind of forced to using, and I bet the polling indicated this, the most popular thing the Democrats had going for them was not Trump. And so that was 100% the entire focus of that campaign in the closing days. That I think is very interesting, again, from a national perspective, the degree to which, you have a Democratic Party that was able to take power through that 2020 election, but cannot really wield it as an operating coalition. And, if anyone thinks that last night changed the opinion of either the two camps strongly entrenched in the progressive left or the Manchin cinema group, that divide's only gotten bigger because of the complete humiliation of last night. And that is something that is going to be interesting with ramifications beyond, if you're a citizen of the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Well, that just makes Manchin double down, right, on his playing both sides strategy.
The progressives are going to say, well, look, Terry McAuliffe was an old school Clinton person. If we had run on, giving every Virginian $1,000 or whatever, we would have been delivering for the working class, and that was the problem. The New Jersey race is going to make that a little bit different for, I think, Reese might touch on, but both sides, even the progressives, are going to say the only chance we have of winning now is by delivering on the promises that people put us to run on in 2020 or whatever.
Well, before we go to New Jersey, do you know if Virginia has a U.S. Senate race next year?
Warner was on the ballot in 2020, so he is not an issue. So that's it's the degree to which that'll be another thing is whether this is something that just Republicans are able to build on, or is it is the opinion of national government, federal representation, different than what they want from a governor? That wouldn't surprise me at all. And considering just the really, Northern Virginia is such a, it's their interests align with the progressive agenda. Anyone that wants to defend the jobs of bureaucrats up in D.C. Is going to end up doing pretty well in Virginia. But it does look so. So Kane was reelected in 2018. So yeah, I guess that would put him in 2024. So yeah, the no 2022 election.
And that is a relevant difference, right? Because you do have quite a number of states where, when it comes to state races, are solidly red, and yet they might elect a Democrat to a federal office, or the reverse in many cases. And also in terms of presidential races, right? You could name some states. I'm trying to think of some right off the top of my head, that in terms of presidential races are pretty much always reliably blue. And yet, well, I mean, take New Jersey, take Massachusetts, take Maryland, right? In terms of presidential races, you would be shocked to your foundation if any of those states voted for a Republican president. And yet sometimes Republicans win statewide office in those states. So there is clearly a difference in whether you're running for federal office or whether you're running for state office. And I think maybe that has something to do with just state races often focus on much more local issues. And I think there's a personality factor at play when you're president. And so, yeah, I guess I shouldn't overgeneralize too much about this in terms of federal races coming up, but it certainly doesn't hurt. And as I mentioned, right, for the future, if you've got people, now you've got 3 people who you know can win a statewide race in Virginia, that would certainly seem to help them out with building their organization for any future statewide races or congressional races then.
Absolutely. And I also don't want to try to suggest that there's a possibility that the Republican senator wouldn't be very much in favor of keeping up as much blooded pork in Northern Virginia as possible either. I don't want to come across as trying to get too much of an advantage there. But yeah, it's the different. There's a lot of people that would be perfectly okay with raising taxes on the rich, but don't want to see the property taxes go up.
Well, I've seen that at work in a lot of cases where I've known state legislators who, as state legislators, were really quite good. Even on foreign policy, were pretty decent. But as soon as they get into Congress, they become immediately worse on a wide variety of policies. And how that happens, I don't know, because I don't know firsthand the culture in Washington. I do know the culture firsthand at the State House. And my impression is it's very different from what goes on in Washington. So, yeah, it does seem that going to Washington does actually make you worse in a lot of cases when someone moves from the State House to Congress. So, yeah, I mean, that's always just something to keep in mind. And also just another illustration, I think, of how the federal government is just kind of worse in general, both in practice and in its very nature. But let's move on to New Jersey now. I haven't looked lately. I don't know what the governor's race turned out with there. And I assume that that's also a Democrat trifecta, but maybe what looks like it might change there?
So currently, Phil Murphy does have a slight advantage. It's one of those races where it's going to take a couple days because they're going to be, it's less than 1%. It's going to be, probably be a recount sort of situation. I'm fully expecting that Murphy is going to win. What's interesting here is, the Republican in this race, Jack Chiatrelli. I didn't know who. I'm a politics nerd.
We're not from New Jersey, so we don't know how to pronounce these names. But it ends in a vowel, so he's a good guy.
He's probably friends with Joe Salerno. But I'm an elections nerd. I had no idea who this guy was until 2 weeks ago. No one was really talking about this race. I knew Murphy was running for re-election. I had this hope that the same sort of kind of building backlash that you could feel would be felt in New Jersey. You did have some very prominent. I know there was a gym owner there who made a lot of headlines for pushing back against the lockdowns. There's been a lot of great leaders on that resistant sort of culture within that state, but I just assume that, it's going to be, Murphy won by I think like 18 points last time around. Now, and then this came out. Polling didn't pick this up. This is one of those elections that I don't fault the polls too much because this is one of those things where turnout from those angry, disaffected, these angry voters is something you can't predict. And this is something that, prior to the 2020 election, when we had all these returns coming in about how, this is going to be the most historically high election of all time, therefore Trump is necessarily doomed because of the prevailing narrative that high turnout elections ends up benefiting Democrats. The kind of unsaid aspect of that is, low common denominator voters are going to be motivated by celebrities and this sort of, pumping sort of thing. And so the people that vote that normally don't are going to be just a demographic that they think benefits them, right? And it wasn't the case. Again, the presidential election was extraordinarily close and Republicans made gains all around. This is something that, again, I think it's an aspect where libertarians, conservatives, of all stripes kind of miss. And when Rothbard was talking about in politics of second half of the 1800s, one of our favorite times, he would talk about how the way that political parties would succeed was not by trying to win over some sort of mythical, independent swing voter, but instead doing, juicing out the turnout of the people that they knew were their voters. And I think that the more we have this sort of culture war sort of age, what we're seeing is that you have a lot of people who, may never have liked George W. Bush, don't particularly care about corporate tax cuts, don't know what the National Review is, but they recognize that, normalizing, transgendered men in women's bathrooms is a problem, right? And they recognize that there's something icky, there's something hostile. They don't like not going around and walking around town without a mask on. They don't want to be forced to get a jab. And that is what's propelling, again, non-traditional voters to vote as backlash to the regime. And that's where I think there's a lot to learn from Jack Rothbard's analysis of that period, a lot of some of the populist aspects that I talked about at Mises U, and then I think from my personal perspective, I've been diving into those sort of areas. That's the aspect that I find so exciting about this, because this is something that really could be revolutionary if utilized and promoted in the right way, which is obviously genuine decentralization of power in the regime.
You mentioned turnout. Looking here at the New Jersey results, right? Why is it? I've never talked to anybody about this. So, and I live in a state where it's all mail-in voting and has been for a long time. And so in this, it shows here with the New Jersey results that our buddy Jack Ciattarelli, he's winning only in election day votes, and that the Dems have huge advantages in early by mail votes and early in person votes. Although it's a huge advantage in by mail, and then a much smaller advantage in person votes. So, what is the Republican thinking on that? Why do Republicans not like the early voting thing?
A part of it comes from I think there's kind of just long historical trends in most states. Florida's a little bit unique because of, vote by mail was always very popular with older voters that tend to be Republican. But for the most part, I think this has been a longer trend. And I think it's something that's obviously been amplified even more given a lot of the concerns about election integrity that came from 2020. And so, again, historically, it's been that election day vote that has been what makes the difference up in national politics. And this is often why, a lot there's they try to play this battle off legislatively a lot. I know I think like the federal HR1 Democratic law for federal election reform was trying to make every single state have a month of early voting, because they recognize that that's an aspect that I don't know why that tends to, why Democrats are early voters in that regard, but it is something that's historically been true.
You're right, because it's not just policy; it's in their actual participation, right? So clearly, there's it seems top down. The Democrats like these early types of voting, and Republicans apparently dislike it. Would you say, though, were Republicans successful at turnout in Virginia? And I know nothing about New Jersey, and if they were any good at that there.
Yes, I mean you have some counties in Virginia, like in the Southern Peninsula, where again Trump was winning. Literally 80-20, 83-20, or 83-18, things like that, and the Republican turnout was Youngkin in an off-year election, was matching or surpassing some of those numbers, and also includes in terms of even raw vote numbers in some of those areas. And so again, this was a weaponized turnout your base sort of thing across the board.
I guess it would seem that you have to just convince these people then to vote, even if they are in a place where they're surrounded by like-minded people, that vote matters in Richmond or Trenton or whatever, even though you're out in the middle of nowhere and it seems everyone agrees with you. I guess you still have to get your vote counted.
Yes. No, absolutely. And again, this is what was the origin of the political party system. Again, that goes on to good old Van Buren, Jacksonian era stuff. It's like that's what they tried to weaponize was making sure that those communities that were like-minded were as politically engaged as possible.
And maybe some of these voters also figured out that if they're going to win, they're going to have like a padding, a built-in advantage, because if they are going to suspect shenanigans, and rightly so, there's good reason to suspect it, although it's always unknown as to what extent cheating might take place. Why not be on the safe side, right, and convince your people that we can't just win. We've got to win by like 5% minimum, or the Dems are going to cheat and take it away from us. It would seem that would be a compelling argument to make.
Exactly. And this is also where, again, it's interesting to see to what extent do Republicans, again, given this very healthy skepticism of the democratic process, at least I view as very, very healthy skepticism of the democratic process we've seen this past year now, almost to the day, will Republicans, again, use some of these positions of power to actually rein in the way that the voting process itself is handled? Because again, this is something where, again, progressives have long had that advantage where those little procedures of government they've had more interest in than your average conservative who's would rather run the Chamber of Commerce, right? And so again, that's another one of those aspects where do the lower positions turn out to be something that has long-term impact on how this political process plays out from a machine standpoint. And again, when we think about democracy, that is a lot much more healthier way of looking at it than the way that the left, try to use it as some sort of God-ordained right to do whatever, they wanted to do before the election anyway. One of the other things, though, in the New Jersey race that I do want to mention before we may have to move on is again my favorite man of yesterday's election, Edward Durr, who beat Senate President Steve Sweeney, the New Jersey's longest-running state Senate president, mind you. Mr. Durr is a truck driver who spent a grand total of $153 on Dunkin' Donuts and paper flyers over the course of his campaign. He had no website. He had a Facebook page that was 2 lines, and again, more than 99% of the precincts are reporting he's 2,000 votes up. This is the best thing possible.
Yeah, the latest headline that I can find from 31 minutes ago is Edward Durr positioned to upset Sweeney in New Jersey District 3 state Senate race. That's from Fox 29, the local affiliate, I assume. And so I guess it's getting dangerously close. That's quite humiliating, I would assume, for that senator. Oh,
I saw a video of Mr. Durr, and it was great. He was such a normal. He was a normal guy. I would want that guy to represent me in government. Maybe not after 2 years, well, we'll see if he can withstand up to the positions of the Capitol itself. But right now, there's not many people in the world I'd rather have representing me than Mr. Durr. So my hat is off to him.
Well, let's move on to kind of what this all means for Trump and Trumpism. So no matter what happens in New Jersey, as far as the governor is concerned, it's basically a tie, right? So it's going to be a 50-50 split for the most part. And I've noted that before in writing about past elections. And what is the moral basis for rule when you got a 50-50 split? And there really isn't one, right? It's always helpful to point out that you do have ties in democracy, and it really just comes down to deciding which votes to count, and there's no mandate there. And so the fact that in New Jersey the Democrats are only able to fight to a tie seems like bad news for the Democrats. And then they just straight up lost in Virginia. Now, much has been made then of what this means for Trump, right? And it's been noting that a lot of these candidates were distancing themselves from Trump. And my personal opinion is really that Trump's a great shadow president. You know how Britain has a shadow cabinet and who are poised to take over in case there's a vote of no confidence and that sort of thing. In America, we don't really have that institutionalized, but I like Trump's there throwing bombs from the side and so on. But I don't know that I want to see him return to actual campaigning and that sort of thing. What does this say? Does this say, oh, yeah, we're preparing the coronation for Trump in 2024? Or does this just say that Trump served his purpose, there's a new populist movement, and now we're going to move on with new and younger candidates?
Well, I mean, one thing is to be certain is that whatever your position was before the election, you're now absolutely convinced of it now. The biggest losers of this is the worst people in the world. The Lincoln Project, Bill Kristol, Jennifer Rubin, right? All of those Bush-era neoconservatives that then became Hillary Clinton supporters, who then wanted Terry McAuliffe to still be governor of Virginia. Like, those people have... I don't think you could have lined up a worse, scorecard than what these monsters are. And thankfully, they are now a punchline, and it undermines the legitimacy of any media organization that gives these people a microphone. The Soho Forum debates, excluded from that, right? So that's a good outcome there. You're going to see this battle between, let's call them the post-Trump, populist and the Trumpers still. There are smaller, groups, I think, within conservative circles outside of that, but they don't have power right now. Youngkin himself was kind of, even though he himself was not all a Trumpy sort of candidate, like, he was seen as kind of he was accepted by a lot of the people that liked Trump in the intellectual circles. There's going to be an argument that Youngkin did so much better than Trump because he, it was opposing the modern Democrats without Trumpism. I think that, and they will then also point out that you saw Trump's performance in 2020 contrasted with a lot of some of these races where Republicans won, and they're going to say, okay, well, this is the way to phase out. The problem is, and again, I think to a certain extent, someone like, let's say Ron DeSantis, kind of represents sort of that post-Trump populism. He's kind of a national Youngkin in many ways. The problem, however, is that none of this matters at the end of the day. There's going to be so much ink written about this issue, none of it matters. Because what it comes down with is what does Trump want? Because if Trump, if Trump decided to crush Youngkin, then Youngkin would not win. Doesn't matter how much he was loved in the suburbs. Youngkin has no shot without Trumpers. If Trump didn't like the governor running in New Jersey, the Republican running in New Jersey, this would not be a race. It's precisely the fact that Trump demographic, that Trump voter, who is more loyal to Trump than they are the party, you have to have both of them combined. So if Trump wants to run, then anyone that runs against him is going to be sabotaging himself. What becomes interesting is a Republican Party where Trump doesn't run. But I do think you're going to have a lot of people that make that misread that situation. And again, this is where, again, I think there's something to be said about, American politics as a reaction against the powerful elites, is at its best with that Jacksonian model, precisely because you kind of had that celebrity that entertained people who would otherwise, that apathetic voter that is coming out and that historically doesn't, is entertained by Trump style, is entertained by, the vulgarity of the real meaning of "let's go Brandon," right? It's precisely the things that people hate about Trump that reaches the sort of voter that Republicans are now tapping into, that an American right is not going to be able to replace if they go to war with that figure. Again, similarly, when Martin Van Buren went against Jackson on the Texas issue, right, there was no more Martin Van Buren as Democratic leader. That same sort of situation is going to play out here.
All right, well, we'll go ahead and leave it at that for our post-election 2021 discussion. Thank you for joining us this time on Radio Rothbard. We'll see you next time.